Struggling Cowboy shot a man in a duel. Not knowing he was his long-lost younger brother, Jake Cartwright thought he'd won another duel, until the dying stranger whispered one word that shattered 20 years of his life. Brother. The sun had barely cracked the horizon when Jake Cartwright stepped into the dusty street of Millbrook, his boots heavy against the packed earth. The air hung still and cold, carrying the scent of sage and the promise of another scorching day. Behind shuttered windows, the townspeople watched with the hungry silence of vultures, drawn to witness what they hoped would be swift and final. Jake's hand rested easy on his gun, fingers worn smooth from years of practice and necessity. At 38, he'd seen enough duels to know how this would end. The young stranger across from him, barely 20 by the look of him, shifted his weight from foot to foot like a colt learning to stand. Green eyes, bright with something that might have been fear or excitement, never left Jake's face. The boy had called him out the night before, standing in the saloon doorway like death itself. His voice had carried across the smoky room with the kind of authority that didn't match his smooth cheeks and unlined face. Jake Cartwright, he'd said, and every conversation had stopped dead. I'm calling you out. Dawn. Main Street. Jake had barely looked up from his whiskey. Challenges came with the territory when you carried a reputation, and his reputation was written in graves across 3 territories. What's your grievance, boy? You'll know when we're standing face to face. Now they stood 20 paces apart, and Jake still didn't know. The stranger wore a gun belt that looked new, leather still stiff and unmarked by weather. His hat sat straight on his head, not tilted with the casual arrogance of a seasoned gunfighter. Everything about him screamed greenhorn, except for those eyes. Those eyes held something Jake couldn't name, a weight that seemed too heavy for such a young face. Last chance to walk away, Jake called across the dusty space between them. His voice carried the weariness of a man who'd offered too many last chances to count. Whatever you think I'd done to you, it ain't worth dying over. The stranger's mouth twitched into something that might have been a smile. Maybe it ain't about what you'd done to me, Jake Cartwright. Maybe it's about what you'd done to yourself. The words hit Jake like a slap, but he kept his face stone. A philosophy from a boy who probably hadn't been off his mama's farm more than a season. You talk too much for a man about to die. Maybe I do. The stranger's hand moved to hover over his gun, fingers steady despite his youth. But a man's got to say his piece before he goes quiet forever. Jake felt the familiar calm settle over him, the cold stillness that came before violence. It was a feeling he'd grown to hate and depend on in equal measure. Time slowed to honey, and he could hear every small sound, a shutter creaking in the wind, a horse nickering in the livery stable, his own heartbeat steady as a drum. The stranger's eyes never wavered. There was something in them that nagged at Jake, a flicker of recognition he couldn't place. Maybe he'd seen the boy before, in another town, another time. Faces had a way of blending together when you lived on the drift, but those green eyes felt familiar as his own reflection. You ready? Jake asked. The stranger nodded once, quick and sharp. His hand tensed over his gun, and Jake saw the moment the boy made his choice. It always showed in the eyes first, that split second when a man decided to live or die. Jake's draw was smooth as water, practiced as breathing. The Colt filled his hand like it belonged there, barrel finding its target with the certainty of long habit. The stranger was fast, faster than Jake had expected, but not fast enough. Never fast enough. The sound of gunfire cracked across the morning like thunder, echoing off the false fronts of the buildings that lined the street. Dust rose in small puffs where boots had shuffled for position. The smell of gunpowder hung sharp and bitter in the still air. Jake stood with his smoking gun in his hand, watching the stranger crumple to his knees in the dirt. Blood spread across the boy's chest like spilled paint, dark against the pale fabric of his shirt. The stranger's gun lay in the dust beside him, barely cleared from its holster. For a moment, the only sound was the stranger's labored breathing. Jake holstered his gun and started forward, meaning to check if the boy would live long enough for a doctor. He'd killed enough men to know the difference between a dying wound and a healing one, and this one would be quick. The stranger's eyes found his as Jake knelt beside him. Up close, those green eyes were even more familiar, holding depths that seemed impossible in such a young face. The boy's lips moved, trying to form words around the blood that bubbled at the corners of his mouth. "What?" Jake asked, though he didn't expect an answer that would make sense. "Why throw your life away for nothing?" The stranger's hand reached out, fingers grasping at Jake's shirt with desperate strength. When he spoke, his voice was barely a whisper, but the word came clear as church bells on Sunday morning. "Brother." The world tilted sideways. Jake's vision blurred at the edges, and for a moment he couldn't breathe, couldn't think, couldn't do anything but stare into those green eyes that suddenly weren't familiar. They were identical. Identical to the ones that looked back at him from mirrors and still water, identical to the ones he remembered from 20 years ago on a face much younger than this one. "Tommy." The name fell from Jake's lips like a prayer or a curse. "Tommy, is that you?" But Tommy's eyes were already growing distant, focused on something Jake couldn't see. The hand that had gripped his shirt went slack, falling to rest in the dust. The labored breathing stopped, and with it, the last sound Jake's little brother would ever make. Jake knelt there in the street with Tommy's blood on his hands and the weight of 20 years crashing down around him like an avalanche. Somewhere behind him, he could hear the townspeople emerging from their hiding places, voices low and full of speculation. But their words meant nothing now. Nothing meant anything now except the terrible understanding that he'd just killed the one person in the world he'd spent half his life trying to find. The morning sun climbed higher, painting the dust with shades of gold and amber, but Jake couldn't feel its warmth. All he could feel was the cold spreading through his chest like winter, and the question that would haunt him until his dying day. How long had Tommy been looking for him, and why had their reunion ended with a gun? The dying boy's belongings held a secret that would haunt Jake forever. A photograph and a letter that revealed 20 years of searching had led to this moment of unforgivable tragedy. Jake's hand shook as he lifted Tommy from the dust, blood soaking through his shirt and staining his arms. The boy felt lighter than he should have, all bone and sinew like he hadn't been eating regular. Jake had carried dead men before, but never one whose weight seemed to grow heavier with each step, never one whose face looked so much like his own. The townspeople parted before him like water, their earlier excitement curdling into uncomfortable silence. A few women crossed themselves. Old Pete from the general store removed his hat and held it to his chest. Jake walked through their whispered speculations and pointed stares, feeling each word like a brand against his skin. Heard the boy call him brother. 20 years since the Cartwright place burned. Always wondered what happened to that family. The undertaker's parlor sat at the end of Main Street, a narrow building squeezed between the blacksmith and the seamstress shop. Josiah Mills had been laying folks to rest in Millbrook for near 30 years, and his lined face showed every one of them. He opened the door before Jake reached it, stepping aside without a word. Jake laid Tommy on the wooden table, and for the first time since the gunshot, he really looked at his brother's face. 20 years had changed the chubby-cheeked boy he remembered into a man with sharp cheekbones and a jaw that could have been carved from the same stone as Jake's own. But the eyes were the same, green as spring grass, even clouded with death. "I'll need his things," Josiah said quietly, his voice carrying the practiced gentleness of a man accustomed to grief. For the record, Jake's hands felt clumsy as he searched Tommy's pockets. A few crumpled bills, some loose change, a piece of jerky wrapped in cloth. Nothing that explained why his little brother had grown up to call him out in the street. Nothing that made sense of the waste lying cold on Josiah's table. Then his fingers found the saddlebags Tommy had dropped when he fell. Jake lifted them with the careful reverence of a man handling something sacred, knowing somehow that whatever lay inside would change everything. The first thing he found was a photograph, creased and yellowed with age. Jake's breath caught in his throat as he recognized the image, his whole family standing in front of their old homestead. His pa, tall and proud with his hand on Ma's shoulder. Ma, beautiful even in the faded sepia tones, holding baby Sarah in her arms. And there, standing between Jake and Tommy, was his own 15-year-old self, grinning at the camera like he owned the world. Tommy couldn't have been more than 5 when the picture was taken, all wild hair and missing teeth, clutching a wooden horse Jake had whittled for him. The same green eyes that had stared up at Jake in adoration every day until the Apache raids came and scattered their family like leaves in a storm. Jake's vision blurred as the memories came flooding back. Tommy following him everywhere, begging to help with the horses. Tommy's laugh echoing across the barnyard. Tommy crying when Jake left for town, afraid his big brother wouldn't come back. The last time Jake had seen him alive, really alive, Tommy had been hiding under the bed while smoke filled the house and war cries split the night. "I'll find you," Jake had promised, pulling Tommy out from his hiding place. "Soon as it's safe, I'll come back for you." But safe had never come. The Apache had burned half the territory before moving on, leaving behind a landscape of ash and heartbreak. Jake had searched for months, following rumors and false leads, but Tommy and the others had vanished like smoke. Eventually, Jake had given up and drifted west, carrying the guilt of his broken promise like a stone in his chest. Josiah cleared his throat softly. "There's more." Jake's hands shook as he reached deeper into the saddlebags. His fingers closed around an envelope, thick with paper and worn soft from handling. His name was written on the outside in careful block letters. Not Jake Cartwright, like the stranger in the saloon had called him, but Jacob, the name only family had used. Inside were dozens of letters, all addressed to him, all returned to sender. Jake's hands trembled as he unfolded the first one, dated 3 years ago. "Dear Jacob, I don't know if this letter will find you, but Mrs. Henderson at the orphanage in Santa Fe said she heard tell of a gunfighter named Jake Cartwright who might be my brother. I know it's been a long time, but I never stopped looking. Never stopped hoping you kept your promise to come back. I'm working a ranch outside Tucson now. Good honest work. I saved up enough money to start searching proper like. Been following stories about you across 3 territories. Some folks say you're a killer. Some say you're a good man who's had to make hard choices. I reckon I know which one's true. If you get this, I'm staying at the Bella Vista Hotel in Tucson through the end of the month. I'll wait as long as I can. Your brother, Thomas Cartwright. Jake's hands shook so hard he could barely hold the paper. He opened another letter, then another. Each one told the same story. Tommy searching, always searching, following Jake's trail from town to town like a man chasing ghosts. The letters grew more desperate as the years passed, more urgent, as if Tommy knew time was running out. The last letter was dated just 2 weeks ago. "Jacob, I found you. Really found you this time. You're in Millbrook, working for the Barty Ranch. I'm coming to see you, but I heard some troubling stories. They say you've gone hard, that you kill for money now. I can't believe that of the brother who carved me wooden horses and taught me to read by firelight. But if it's true, if you've become what they say you have, then I can't let you keep hurting people. Our pa raised us better than that. Our ma would be ashamed. I'm praying it's not true. I'm praying you're still the brother I remember. But if you're not, if you've really become a killer, then I'll do what I have to do to stop you. I love you, Jacob. I always have. But I won't let you shame our family name." Tommy, the letter fell from Jake's nerveless fingers, fluttering to the floor like a dying bird. Everything became clear in them. The challenge, the strange words about what Jake had done to himself, the weight in Tommy's young eyes. His brother hadn't come to Millbrook looking for a reunion. He'd come looking for justice, ready to kill the man he thought Jake had become rather than let him keep bringing dishonor to the Cartwright name. And Jake had killed him for it. Had drawn faster and shot straighter and proven every terrible thing Tommy had feared about him. The brother who'd once carved wooden toys and read bedtime stories had become exactly the kind of man who would gun down his own blood Jake sank into the chair beside Josiah's table, the weight of 20 years pressing down on him like a mountain. He'd spent so long running from his past that he'd become the very thing his family would have despised. And now Tommy was dead, and there was no taking back the bullet, no undoing the terrible irony of a reunion that had ended in fratricide. Outside, the sun climbed higher in the sky, but Jake felt only darkness settling around him like a shroud. Somewhere in the distance, a church bell tolled the hour, and each note sounded like judgment falling from heaven, counting out the seconds of a life he no longer knew how to live. The wooden horse from the photograph lay in the dust of Main Street, forgotten and broken, like every promise Jake had ever made and failed to keep. Sarah Mackenzie had buried her own husband to senseless violence. Now she watched Jake Cartwright destroying himself with guilt, and she knew exactly what demons he was fighting. 3 days after the funeral, Jake sat in the saloon, nursing his fourth whiskey of the morning, staring at the amber liquid like it held answers to questions he couldn't bear to ask. The other patrons gave him wide berth, their conversations dropping to whispers when he passed. Word had spread fast about what had happened in the street, and with it came the kind of notoriety Jake had never wanted. The whiskey burned going down, but not enough to kill the taste of regret that coated his tongue like ash. He tried sleeping in his room at the boarding house, but every time he closed his eyes, he saw Tommy falling, heard that single word, brother, echoing in the darkness like a curse. The saloon doors swung open, letting in a shaft of afternoon sunlight that made Jake squint. He expected to see another curious townsperson come to gawk at the man who'd killed his own kin, but instead, Sarah Mackenzie stepped through the doorway like a vision in calico and determination. Jake had noticed her before, of course. Hard not to notice a woman like Sarah in a town like Millbrook. She was maybe 30, with dark hair she kept pinned back neat and proper, and eyes the color of storm clouds that seemed to see more than most folks let on. She'd been widowed 2 years back when her husband caught a stray bullet in a range war that had nothing to do with him, leaving her to run their small farm alone. She walked straight to Jake's table without hesitation, her boots clicking against the wooden floor like a countdown. The bartender, old Charlie Moss, started forward as if to intervene, but Sarah stopped him with a look that could have frozen summer. "Mr. Cartwright," she said, settling into the chair across from him like she'd been invited. "You look like a man who hasn't had a proper meal in days." Jake lifted his eyes from his whiskey, studying her face for signs of the morbid curiosity that had driven every other visitor away. Instead, he found something he hadn't expected, understanding tinged with a sadness that matched his own. "Not hungry," he mumbled, turning back to his drink. "Grief has a way of stealing a man's appetite," Sarah said quietly. "But it'll steal his strength too, if he lets it. And for what I hear, you're going to need all the strength you can get." Something in her tone made Jake look up again. "What's that supposed to mean?" Sarah folded her hands on the table, and Jake noticed the calluses on her fingers, the way her sleeves were worn thin from hard work. This wasn't a woman who'd lived an easy life, but there was steel in her spine that spoke of someone who'd faced down hardship and come out standing. It means the guilt's eating you alive, and unless you find a way to make peace with what happened, you'll drink yourself into the ground or put a bullet in your own head before winter comes. Her words carried the matter-of-fact tone of someone stating an obvious truth. "I've seen it before." Jake's hand tightened around his glass. "You don't know nothing about what I'm carrying." "Don't I?" Sarah's eyes held steady on his. "My husband died in a gunfight that started over a poker game. Stupid, senseless violence that left me alone and him dead for no reason anybody could explain. You think I don't know about carrying weight you can't put down?" The comparison hit Jake like a physical blow. "Your husband didn't die by your hand." "No," Sarah agreed. "But I spent plenty of nights wondering if I could have stopped it. If I'd asked him to stay home that night. If I'd hidden his gun. If I'd been a better wife who could have kept him away from trouble." She paused, letting the words settle. "Guilt's got 1,000 different faces, Mr. Cartwright, but it all tastes the same in the end." Jake studied her face, searching for judgment or pity or any of the emotions he'd grown accustomed to seeing in people's eyes. Instead, he found only a quiet strength that reminded him of his mother, back when the world still made sense. "Why do you care?" he asked finally. Sarah was quiet for a long moment, her gaze drifting to the window where dust motes danced in the afternoon light. "Because I knew your brother," she said simply. The words hit Jake like a punch to the gut. "You knew Tommy? He worked for the Henderson spread for about 6 months, 2 years back. Good worker, quiet, always polite when he came to town for supplies." Sarah's voice took on a gentle quality, like she was handling something fragile. "He used to ask questions about the local families, especially anyone named Cartwright. Said he was looking for someone." Jake's throat tightened. "What else?" "He helped me fix my barn roof that winter, wouldn't take a penny for the work. Said his brother had taught him that family helped family, and when family wasn't around, decent folks looked after each other." Sarah's eyes found his again. "He talked about you sometimes. About the brother who'd taught him to whittle, who'd promised to come back for him." The whiskey glass trembled in Jake's hand. "He shouldn't have come looking. Should have left things alone." "Maybe," Sarah said, "but he loved you. Even after all those years, even with all the stories he'd heard, he still loved you. That's not something a man should regret." Jake shook his head, the weight of his guilt pressing down like a physical force. "Love got him killed. My own brother, and I put him in the ground without even knowing who he was. And now you're trying to follow him there," Sarah observed. "Is that what he would have wanted?" "Don't matter what he wanted. He's dead." Sarah reached across the table and covered Jake's hand with hers. Her skin was warm and callous from work, real in a way that cut through the fog of whiskey and self-pity. "Tommy Henderson, that was the name he went by, sent money to the orphanage in Santa Fe every month. $20, regular as clockwork. Sister Mary Catherine told me he never missed a payment, not once in all the time she knew him." Jake's breath caught. $20, every month for 3 years. Said it was for the children who didn't have anybody looking out for them. Sarah's grip on his hand tightened. "You became a good man, Jake. Whatever happened to your family all those years ago, whatever pain he carried, he turned it into something worthwhile. That's the brother you should remember." Tears Jake hadn't shed since childhood burned at the corners of his eyes. He'd been so focused on his own guilt, his own pain, that he'd barely considered what kind of man Tommy had become. But Sarah's words painted a picture of someone Jake could be proud of, a brother who'd taken the lessons their parents had taught and used them to make the world a little better. "I don't know how to live with this," Jake admitted, his voice barely above a whisper. Sarah squeezed his hand once more before letting go. "One day at a time. Same way anybody learns to live with loss." She stood, smoothing down her skirts. "Come to my place tomorrow for supper. 7 o'clock. And Jake, bring your brother's letters. I think you need to read them all, not just the ones that hurt." She walked away without waiting for an answer, leaving Jake alone with his whiskey and the echo of her words. Outside, the wind picked up, rattling the saloon windows like restless spirits, and for the first time since Tommy died, Jake wondered if maybe the living still had obligations that death couldn't erase. Jake carved a wooden toy horse with trembling hands, knowing it was 20 years too late, but some promises he realized could still be kept even after death. The first frost came early that year, coating the wooden cross that marked Tommy's grave with crystals that caught the morning light like scattered diamonds. Jake knelt in the cemetery grass, his breath forming small clouds in the cold air as he placed the wooden horse beside the headstone he'd finally been able to afford. He'd spent 3 weeks carving that horse, working by lamplight in his room at the boarding house while autumn winds howled outside his window. His hands had lost some of their steadiness over the years. Too much whiskey, too many quick draws, but muscle memory guided his knife through the pine, shaping ears and mane and the proud arch of neck he remembered from the toy he'd made Tommy all those years ago. "It ain't much," Jake said to the silent grave. "Nothing like the one I made you when you were little. But I figured you might want it anyway." The wind stirred the dying grass, carrying with it the scent of winter and change. Behind him, footsteps approached across the cemetery grounds. Jake didn't need to turn around to know it was Sarah. Over the past 2 months, she'd become as regular as sunrise in his life, appearing when the darkness got too heavy, offering food when he forgot to eat, sitting in comfortable silence when words weren't enough. "The children are asking for you," Sarah said, settling onto the ground beside him despite her good dress. "Mary Patterson learned all her letters yesterday. She wanted you to know." Jake nodded, a small smile tugging at the corner of his mouth. The schoolhouse had been Tommy's idea, in a way. Jake had found more letters in his brother's belongings, along with a bank book showing the money Tommy had saved over the years. Nearly $800, earned through honest work and careful living. Money that could have bought Tommy a small spread of his own, a chance at the kind of life their parents had dreamed of for their children. Instead, Jake had used it to build what the town needed most: a one-room schoolhouse where children could learn to read and write, to cipher numbers, and understand the world beyond Millbrook's dusty borders. It wasn't much, just a simple building with wooden benches and a slate board, but it was something clean and good rising from the ashes of tragedy. Tommy would have liked that, Jake said, running his fingers over the smooth wood of the toy horse. He always was quick with letters. Quicker than me, anyway. Sarah adjusted her shawl against the cold, her eyes studying the inscription Jake had paid to have carved into the headstone: Thomas Tommy Cartwright. "Beloved brother." He never stopped looking. "You've been teaching them more than letters," she observed. "Yesterday, I heard Billy Thompson telling his ma that Mr. Jake said a man's word was his bond, and that keeping promises was more important than being fast with a gun." Jake felt heat rise in his cheeks. Kids need to know there's better ways to handle things than violence. Ways that don't end with. He gestured helplessly at the grave. "Ways that don't end with brothers killing brothers," Sarah finished softly. The words still carried weight, but the sharp edges of guilt had worn smooth over the months. Not gone. Jake figured that particular burden would ride with him until his own grave, but tempered by purpose, by the slow satisfaction of watching children learn to read words Tommy had written in his letters, by the gradual acceptance of a community that had seen him change. "I got word from the county yesterday," Jake said. "They're sending a proper teacher come spring. Someone with real education, not just a broken-down gunfighter with more regrets than sense." Sarah's hand found his shoulder, warm through his coat. "And what will you do then?" Jake was quiet for a long moment, watching the wind scatter leaves across the cemetery grounds. "Been thinking about that. Got an offer to work at the Henderson place. Honest work, breaking horses, mending fences. Nothing that requires iron on my hip." "That sounds good," Sarah said, and something in her voice made him look at her more closely. She was studying the grave marker, but Jake caught the faint color in her cheeks, the way her fingers worried at the edge of her shawl. Over the months, their friendship had deepened into something neither of them had quite named, built on shared grief and quiet understanding. She'd shown him how to live with loss without letting it consume him, and he'd helped her repair her farm and face the lonely evenings when memories grew too heavy to bear alone. "Sarah," he started, then stopped, the words tangling on his tongue. She looked at him then, gray eyes clear and direct. "I know, Jake. I know what you're trying to say. Do you? You're thinking that a man with blood on his hands isn't fit company for a decent woman. That you've got too many ghosts to make a proper husband." Her voice carried gentle certainty. "You're thinking Tommy's death is a debt you'll never finish paying." Jake's throat tightened. She knew him better than he'd thought, could see right through the careful walls he'd built around his heart. "Maybe," he admitted. Sarah turned to face him fully, her hands coming up to frame his weathered face. "Let me tell you what I'm thinking. I'm thinking that a man who builds schoolhouses for his dead brother, who teaches children that words are stronger than bullets, who carves wooden horses with hands that shake from grief, that a man worth knowing. Worth loving, even." The words hung between them like a bridge across a canyon, spanning the distance between what had been and what might yet be. Jake felt something shift inside his chest, a loosening of the tight knot of self-condemnation he'd carried for so long. "I ain't the same man I was," he said finally. "None of us are," Sarah replied. "That's the point." A hawk circled overhead, riding the cold currents with effortless grace. Somewhere in town, the school bell rang, calling children to their lessons. Life moved forward, as it always did, carrying the living toward whatever waited beyond the next horizon. Jake picked up the wooden horse, studying the simple curves he'd carved by lamplight and memory. It wasn't perfect. One ear sat slightly higher than the other, and the mane could have been smoother, but it was made with love, crafted by hands that had learned to create instead of destroy. He placed it gently against the headstone, where the first snows would cover it and the spring rains would weather it gray. But it would endure as love endured, as memory endured, as the hope for redemption endured even in the hardest hearts. "I kept my promise, Tommy," Jake whispered. "Took me 20 years and cost us both more than it should have, but I came back. I came back, and I ain't leaving again." Sarah's hand slipped into his, fingers intertwining with the easy familiarity of two people who'd found their way to each other through the darkness. Together, they stood and walked back toward town, toward the schoolhouse where children waited to learn that every ending could become a beginning, and that even the deepest regrets could be transformed into something resembling grace. Behind them, the wind stirred the grass around Tommy's grave, and if Jake listened carefully, he could almost hear his brother's laughter carried on the autumn air. Not the bitter sound of dying, but the pure joy of a child who'd finally been found by the brother who'd promised never to leave him behind again. The wooden horse watched over it all, silent and patient as carved wood could be, holding vigil in a place where love and loss walked hand in hand beneath the endless western sky.